To our followers for a discussion of a group of friends and leaders in the pediatrics. We've had a number of discussions about the challenges of recruiting and searching for diverse outcomes in our searches. And one of the challenges that we have really battered about a bit is, the issue of how to respectfully treat internal candidates. And this is a common problem. And so today we thought we'd just sort of reflect on some of our experiences in dealing and respecting internal candidates. One of the questions that comes up immediately is it always necessary to have a search for, say, a division chief when there is a very strong number two in a division that's been mentored and has a lot of leadership experience? Anyone want to comment on that?
Well, I think that a good chair, a good division chief, a good dean is always working hard to develop and mentor candidates at every level to be competitive for leadership positions. And I think that's a prime role and responsibility for any of us that are in leadership. And we should be constantly thinking about and being committed to developing leadership from within. My bias around your question, which is, okay, you've got candidates that you've been grooming, you're going to launch a search. Why not just give them the job? My bias is that is a really bad decision. It's a bad decision for the candidate. It's a bad decision for the community that they would assume leadership for. Because one of the most important things through the search process, and it's very separate from grooming and mentoring someone for leadership, is that the community gets to have a chance to reflect, if a search is done well, on what you're doing well, where your opportunities for growth are, where your threats are, and to really take a really deep dive at a point in time and say, well, this is where we are today. Where do we want to be tomorrow? And there's not often alignment in the community as to the answers to those questions. And the candidate themselves may have a very defined view, having been part of that community. And perhaps it's a view that isn't as widespread and as open as it needs to be. And so the search process allows, and I could go on, but just to get things started, it allows the candidate and the community to really think deeply about where the future is and to help prepare the roadmap for the leadership position. And that roadmap cannot be done as well as I think it can be done without a robust search.
Those are great points. I might just quickly add, I always found too that having an outstanding panel of candidates for any level often brought new ideas that we hadn't thought of, so that the the organization learns from the candidates themselves as they evaluate and participate. Danielle, you said you had a comment?
Yeah, I mean, again, Valerie, you keep saying the things that are in my head. So I think it's exactly on point. The other thing is, obviously we've all had the opportunity to take a look at different institutions and to look at their culture. And to add to what Valerie said, I think the culture is self-perpetuating when you don't broaden the horizons. And that is often very intentional, that it be self-perpetuating. You might say that it is less disruptive to a particular culture that's comfortable in where it's at, but it also is limiting, in my view, in terms of new ideas and the ability to reflect on things that may be uncomfortable. So I fully agree that, and I've seen it done where either the search is pretty narrow, you ask just a few internal candidates to apply, but you've already made up your mind. That's not, a fun process. Or that you engage in a search, but you've already made up your mind. So I think that opportunity to be open to learning and to actually be engaged in the process is really important for an institution. And by the way, very respectful of the internal candidate, that you don't just say, okay, you're the default, so we will always rely on you, because that doesn't challenge. The other measure of success is that those you have mentored and sponsored actually go to other institutions and create change. So I fully agree with Valerie.
Chris, you may have given some thought to how do you select when there's an interim position, and can you really anticipate whether they're going to be a candidate or not? And any thoughts on that? That's kind of a conundrum.
Well, yeah, thanks, Bruder. I guess I should say, first of all, that I was actually brought into my first leadership position without there having been a search done. I think you know that, Bruder. It was not my current institution. I should say that. And I was naive enough, thankfully, not to realize only years later, when other leaders in that department, let me know that they were appalled that I was more or less an internal candidate, and just basically came in as a leader. And if I had known, if I had known what the antipathy or and again, it wasn't necessarily something about me personally, but just the fact that there hadn't been a search done and their input had not been solicited, just as you said, Valerie. If I'd known that, I could never have gone through the first several years of my position, seeing as I was sort of I'm not sure what. So I totally agree, Valerie and Danielle, that it really is, I think, important to do a search. It really validates the internal candidate, and invites the input on others. So, but I just had to say that, since I am, I suppose I could say I could be a poster child for why this shouldn't happen. You should always have a search. Anyway, so, but as to...
So let me just add a caveat. Oh, sorry, Chris. I was just going to add a caveat, because you don't want to ever do a search where you've already, you bring candidates in, but you're going to give it to that internal candidate. So one strategy that I know others on the call have used is actually to do the search process as if you had 15 candidates, and put that candidate through the same rigor of what would occur. And that allows you, I think, to get that buy-in, get that experience, get that roadmap. And it also sends a message that I'm not guaranteeing you're going to get this job at the end of this process, but you are the natural heir apparent, and I want to make sure. And I've actually had people through that process really re-question whether or not that's what they wanted to do. So I think you can do some kind of hybrid in between.
Well, I'll get back to, Bruder asked about interim. So in an interim position, and that can be tricky in many different ways. But I think my view on it is that it's most important when an interim is appointed or asked, would you like to be an interim, or however this is done, it at least has to start with an understanding of whether that person wants to be, could be an internal candidate for the chair position, for the division chief position, and so forth, realizing that might change during the search process as it goes forward, and some of that depends on how long that person serves as interim, because we all know, the longer you serve as interim and the longer the search goes on, the more likely it is that you're going to wind up in the position, whether you want it or not, I guess. So I don't know if that's helpful, Bruder, but I think it can be very tricky. But if it starts out at least with a frank discussion, is this, because I think for an interim, it's a great way to find out, is this something you might want to do? be a chair, be a division chief. And you get to sort of do it, but at a little bit of a lame duck. But, how is that going to work for you as a potential candidate there or elsewhere? It can be very positive, but having those expectations and discussions clear, or at least your current thoughts about it as a chair, and asking someone to, or a dean, asking someone to be interim, I think is a great way to start, and just be flexible over the next several months or years.
We all want to have people in our departments with leadership skills and qualities. And what's really challenging sometimes when there are multiple internal candidates for a position, that's really challenging. Anyone like Renee, I don't know if you have any thoughts, should internal candidates interview external candidates?
My initial reaction would be probably not, because you do want unbiased, and you don't want a conflict of interest. I mean, if someone is the interim, and as we just pointed out, they may think they don't want the position, but if they evolve into actually enjoying it or getting a lot of positive feedback, that to me would create a conflict. So I would generally say no. But I also wanted to comment on the issue of interims being considered for permanent position, in that when there's no process, the other bodies that are often affected are sometimes external. I am part of a group now that a president is essentially upgrading a interim to a permanent, and without any search even proposed at all. And there are external groups that are very upset about it because it's such a huge position that is being given to an individual without any sort of assessment process whatsoever. So there are other, sometimes external bodies, not just the faculty, but alums or other organizations within the College of Medicine or School of Medicine, who really want to see a process. They want to have, some criteria responded to by an interim. So as Christine has pointed out, it's a real dicey position to be in, but some of this can be avoided with good leadership.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that oftentimes, especially at the division chief level, the opportunity to be an interim acting or an interim division chief is the first real leadership opportunity that individuals have had. And so really, it's very important that the discussion with those individuals is sort of looking at making that individual have a learning experience. It's a productive learning experience, because if you don't lay the groundwork during the interim leadership position, people can have misunderstandings. They can think, oh, well, this is them giving me the job, I'm the preferred candidate, and all of those things. And so it's very important to treat those people, that may sound trite, but it's very important to treat those people as you would like to be treated yourself. I mean, you really need to help them understand the realities of the world, that, obviously being chosen for an interim leadership position, you feel that they have the potential to develop into a real leader, and that this should be looked at as a learning experience by them, and not necessarily an entitlement to be the future, and not to feel bad if they don't get the job. If they decide they want to be a candidate and then they don't get the job, if you have those discussions up front, it makes that a little bit easier to go forward in that direction, if indeed they end up not being the choice, and if indeed they wanted to be the choice. So.
Danielle, did you have any experiences where an internal candidate wasn't selected, and how did you handle that? I have found that to be extremely challenging and sometimes heartbreaking for the internal candidate who kind of anticipated getting the position.
Yeah, so I'll answer that, but also wanted to note from Renee's comment that we haven't used the big P, which is political. and
Yes.
that the
Mhm, mhm.
external kind of comments or the external objections to the process are not important. Sometimes they direct who is going to be appointed without a search process. So depending on the level, it's really quite a political process. But yes, where the interim, I actually have had that experience, and I think being honest and straightforward, respectful and kind, always helps. So if you have, I've had the situation where an internal candidate was not chosen, but it really is how that's handled, whether that is done with transparency and respect in how that person did stay on. I'm thinking of political one situation, and another situation, the person actually wanted to go to the next level and chose to leave the institution, but on good terms. So the way that that happens is really the key. If you disrespect it and you promise something you weren't going to yield, or you use the person, there are users in academic medicine where they use individuals for a particular purpose. That's never appreciated. So I think how you do it, that you're straightforward, you're transparent, you're honest, and you're supportive, will allow people to make individual decisions about their lives and their career. So I hope I answered that. But yes, but it should not, you shouldn't, I don't think you should avoid the process because it's uncomfortable. We're all grown-ups and we can handle bad news.
Arnie, I know that there may not be a best practice, but in your own experience, how did you handle the interview processes? Did you change the process or timing of interviews for internal candidates, or what's been your experience in that regard?
Conducted in such a way that the internal candidates are treated exactly the same way as any external candidates. By that, I mean the schedule should be the same, perhaps with the exception of other potential candidates, but the schedule should be the same, the dinner should be the same, the information should be the same, and the time frame should be the same, so that it's whatever, a 2-day visit, not over a week. I think it's really critical that it be conducted in exactly the same way, so as to emphasize to everyone concerned that it is being done equally. And so I always think there should be a search, and I always think the internal candidates should be treated the same as the external candidates.
I wanted to offer a dissenting opinion about whether internal candidates should interview external candidates. I actually think that particularly at maybe the division chief level or the faculty level, that can be an important beginning of developing relationships. If I were an external candidate and there was an obvious internal candidate, I'd want to know whether she or he, how they would react to my being the external new chief, or what barriers do they see, what problems do they see. I think that's a valuable insight from the external candidate's perspective, and from the internal candidate's perspective, realizing potentially that this external person doesn't have 3 heads and is going to be a good partner and a good colleague. That can be the beginning of a good relationship. So I think in the right circumstances, having the 2 candidates spend time together early in the process can be valuable.
I think if the internal candidate is the interim chief, then it would be at some point challenging not to have met with them. Craig, what?
I was going to say, I think it's very important to be upfront with external candidates when they are meeting with an internal candidate, that indeed they are meeting with someone who's an active internal candidate, because if you're not upfront about that, that can be somewhat awkward if they find out that indeed that was a candidate and they weren't told. So I think it's very important.
Yeah, I was going to follow up on Craig's comment. I do believe engaging with internal candidates as far as them participating is appropriate. I guess a bit sarcastically, you could say if you're worried about your internal candidate, negatively impacting your internal candidates, you would have to ask yourself if they're really a great candidate for your role from a leadership perspective. But I do think candidates, your internal candidates also need protection from the standpoint, if you're going to involve them, it's oftentimes better to do it in a group setting, maybe a dinner or some other related setting, so that there can't be any assertions about their candidacy from insinuations that they tried to torpedo your external candidates and things of that nature. So just some of the things we've seen clients do around the country. But I think one thing I would bring up to the group for quick comment, since we're on this subject though, is we recently were working on a search and there was an internal candidate, the only one from a department. It's for a department chair role in the basic sciences, but the search committee chair believes strongly that she would not be I don't mean a great leader, a great chair, but she wasn't the right fit for the chair role, and believed he was looking out for her in that if she were not selected for the role, it could be more detrimental than being upfront and honest with her upfront about that process, because he had seen more people get disenfranchised by being internal, going through a whole process and not getting the role, and that led to more departures from the organization than it did just being honest and open up front that we are likely going to have far more qualified people for the role come from outside the organization. And so I think that's an interesting dynamic or twist, if you will, to the traditional, we're going to put all internal people through the process, and really thinking about being, I think, fair and transparent with your faculty. So just a different spin on that topic as well that we've seen.
Well, I just have to follow up on what Wes just said. We haven't addressed this specifically, but Wes made the comment, all internal candidates. Again, my bias is it's really, really never good to have more than one internal candidate going through a search process. In some ways, I think it reflects on your leadership that those tough conversations that you might need to be having, you're deferring to a search process. And at the end of that, someone is going to not get the position, and it very well may be two internal candidates. And then you're left with a lot of really difficult emotional, turmoil for the entire community and those two individuals. So I don't know what others think about that, but I think having more than one internal oftentimes is extraordinarily difficult for the search process and the candidates.
Yeah, I think it's really important to remember that there's never a time that you're more vulnerable in the eyes of your colleagues than if you are an internal candidate for the chair position. And you need to be very careful about that person's feelings. I think it was Danielle that said it very well. I mean, at the end of the search process, if they don't get the position, you don't want them to leave because they're bitter. If they leave because they decided, gee, I think I could really be a really good leader, and I have found things in myself that I can do at this other institution and make things happen, that's great. And that may well happen, but that shouldn't happen because they feel very disrespected by the process.
Berta, the thing I would just say in closing, with internal candidates, that's probably a bigger issue is when an organization doesn't have internal candidates, right? I think it's just the opposite side of the question to think about, because I believe all leaders should be grooming a successor. And so it's uncommon that we find organizations where every leader has somebody they are actively grooming to be their successor. And I think it creates a real opportunity, not only for leadership development, but for retention, when you're actively investing in somebody in every division and at the chair level. So just thoughts on that for a future day.